The night over Alexandria was drenched in gold and silence. From the marble terraces of the royal palace, the young Cleopatra watched the Nile flow beneath the moonlight, a silver serpent winding its way through the heart of Egypt. The scent of lotus drifted through the humid air, mingling with the faint rhythm of music from the city below. It was a night for dreams, and Cleopatra was a dreamer, but one who understood that dreams were only worth having if they could be conquered. She was 18, daughter of Ptolemy the Queen, a ruler who bowed to Rome's might more than to Egypt's gods. Cleopatra had grown up amidst whispers of betrayal and fear, her father's courtiers speaking Latin more than an Egyptian, his treasury empty, his pride thinner than parchment. Yet even as a child she had known the difference between weakness and wisdom. Power, she once told her nurse Charmian, is not in the sword or crown, it is in the tongue and in the eyes. When her father died, leaving the throne to Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII, the kingdom cracked like a jar under pressure. The boy king's advisors, greedy men with foreign ambitions, began to whisper that a woman could not rule alone. They plotted in the shadow of the temples, weaving nets of deceit that would soon ensnare Cleopatra herself. One dawn, as the mist rose from the Nile, Cleopatra was led to the desert outskirts of Alexandria, exiled by her own court. She did not cry. She stood at the edge of the sand, her linen robes heavy with dust, her eyes reflecting both fury and fire. Egypt had been ruled by pharaohs for 3,000 years. She would not be the one to surrender it to men of Rome or treacherous priests. "I am Isis reborn," she whispered to the wind, "and Egypt will bow to me again." Days turned into weeks as she wandered the oases with a handful of loyal soldiers. They slept beneath palm trees and drank from shallow wells, their queen sharing every hardship. Her beauty, though dulled by sun and struggle, began to take on a fiercer light, the beauty of endurance. She learned to listen to silence, to read the winds that swept from the west, carrying whispers of the empire that ruled the world, Rome. News came to her like prophecy. Julius Caesar, the Roman general, had arrived in Alexandria to settle the dispute between the siblings. Rome claimed neutrality, but Cleopatra knew better. She knew men like Caesar, men who wore power like armor and desire like perfume. He could destroy her, or he could crown her. So she planned something audacious. One stormy evening, while thunder rolled across the Mediterranean, Cleopatra ordered a single rug to be delivered to Caesar's quarters. Wrapped within that rug, hidden like a secret, was the Queen of Egypt herself. When the fabric unfurled before the Roman conqueror, she rose to her feet, her hair spilling like dark silk over her shoulders. For a moment, Caesar, the man who had bent kings to his will, forgot the weight of his empire. Cleopatra's eyes were not pleading, they were commanding. They spoke of a destiny older than Rome, older than Caesar himself. "You summon me as queen," she said softly, "yet I come as Egypt." That night changed the fate of two empires. In the candlelight of the Alexandrian palace, they spoke of politics and poetry, of gods and ambition. Caesar saw in her not merely a woman, but a mirror one that reflected his hunger for eternity. And Cleopatra saw in him not a saviour, but a ladder one that reached toward the sun. Outside, the city buzzed with rumour. The exiled queen had returned. The palace echoed once again with the voice of a woman calm, intelligent, and dangerously persuasive. By morning, Ptolemy's advisers had fled or fallen silent. Cleopatra, once cast into the desert, now sat again upon the throne of Egypt, her eyes fixed on the horizon where Rome and destiny met. But as she looked out across the Nile, she did not smile. She knew that the gods were generous with their gifts, but cruel in their bargains, and she had just begun to make her first deal with fate. The dawn over Alexandria was the colour of gold and blood, the colours of empire. In the great marble halls of the palace, Cleopatra walked beside Julius Caesar, her steps light, her mind sharp as a blade hidden in silk. Outside, the city bowed before them. The queen had returned, and beside her stood the most powerful man in the world. For the first time in many years, the throne of Egypt was steady. The Nile swelled with life, trade returned, temples reopened. But peace, Cleopatra knew, was a fragile illusion, like a reflection upon water. She could see it shimmering before her, yet feel the danger rippling beneath. Caesar stayed in Alexandria for months, long after politics should have called him back to Rome. He claimed it was to stabilize Egypt, but everyone knew better. The queen had become his fascination, his fire. They dined together beneath painted ceilings, where golden falcons soared, and he listened as she spoke of philosophy and the stars. She read Homer to him in Greek, her voice low and melodic, and when she looked into his eyes, she saw not a god but a man caught between ambition and desire. In him, Cleopatra saw her future. In her, Caesar saw the immortality he had always craved. When she gave birth to his son, Caesarean whispers swept through the empire like desert winds. Some called the child an heir to both Rome and Egypt. Others called him an abomination. Cleopatra held her infant in her arms and smiled at the storm she had unleashed. "Let them whisper," she murmured to the baby. "You are born of the Nile and of thunder. The world will bend to your name." But Rome was a jealous lover. Caesar's power had grown too vast, his dreams too imperial. The Senate murmured in dark corners, daggers glinting in the shadows. Cleopatra sensed it before he did, that invisible tension that gathers before tragedy. When Caesar decided to return to Rome, he promised her the impossible. "I will make our son a prince recognized by Rome," he told her, as they stood on the harbour, the waves licking at the ship's hull. "You will come to Rome as queen, not as guest." Cleopatra smiled, though her heart felt heavy as stone. "Then Rome must learn to kneel before the Nile," she said quietly. Caesar kissed her hand and boarded his ship. She watched it fade into the horizon, leaving her with silence, the kind that only power can bring, vast, lonely, endless. Months later, when news arrived from Rome, it came not as a messenger but as a wound. Caesar was dead, struck down by his own Senate beneath the marble dome of the Curia. His blood had stained the floor of the Republic, and with it, Cleopatra's dreams. The night she heard the news, she locked herself in her chamber. No tears came, only fury. She paced the room, the flicker of oil lamps catching on her gold bracelets. "They have killed not just a man," she whispered, "but an empire unborn." Her advisors begged her to abandon the alliance with Rome, to retreat and guard Egypt's borders. But Cleopatra was no widow, she was a storm. She would not surrender her place in the theatre of history. "Rome owes me a crown," she said, "and I will collect it." So, when Mark Antony Caesar's most loyal general summoned her to meet him in Tarsus, Cleopatra saw more than opportunity. She saw destiny opening its second door. She prepared her voyage not as a queen, but as a goddess. The royal barge was carved in cedar and gilded with gold, its sails perfumed with jasmine and rose oil. Musicians played flutes and harps, while servants scattered petals into the water. As she drifted down the Cydnus River toward Antony, even the wind seemed to bow. When Antony first saw her, he laughed aloud in disbelief and then fell silent. She was not the grieving lover of Caesar he had expected. She was radiant, untouchable, alive with fire. He, the soldier who had conquered nations, felt suddenly like a man conquered. She greeted him with a smile that could have launched ships. "You summoned me as your debtor," she said, her voice honey over steel. "But you forget, General Egypt owes nothing to Rome. Rome owes everything to me." That evening, as music filled the air and the river glimmered beneath torchlight, two souls bound by power and ruin began to circle each other. Antony, bold, reckless, hungry for glory. Cleopatra, cunning, beautiful, hungry for eternity. And as the moon rose high above the waters, Egypt once again became the heart of the world. But the gods, watching from the stars, already knew every flame that burns this bright must one day consume itself. The years that followed were carved from gold and shadow. Under the burning Egyptian sun, Cleopatra and Mark Antony ruled like twin flames, dazzling, defiant and doomed. Together they restored Egypt's power, reigned from Alexandria's marble halls, and defied the cold order of Rome. Their names were whispered in every port, their love sung by poets and cursed by senators. For a time the world belonged to them. Antony had forsaken Rome, for her its politics, its traditions, even his wife. To the Roman Senate he had become a man bewitched. To Cleopatra he had become the heartbeat of an empire reborn. They drank from cups of amethyst and laughed beneath the stars. They hunted lions in the desert, sailed the Nile in moonlight, and dreamed of kingdoms that stretched beyond the horizon. But dreams are fragile things. In Rome, a new power was rising. Octavian, the cold-eyed heir of Caesar. He saw Cleopatra not as a queen but as a threat, and Antony as a traitor. His words spread like poison through the Senate, that Antony had surrendered his soul to an Eastern witch, that he had crowned her queen of kings, that Rome itself trembled beneath her charms. War was no longer a question, it was a promise. When Octavian's fleet advanced upon the Mediterranean, Antony and Cleopatra gathered their ships, hundreds of them, gleaming beneath the sun. The Battle of Actium would decide the fate of empires. On the morning of battle, Cleopatra stood on her ship's deck, her armour of gold and lapis catching the light. She watched Antony, proud, furious, desperate, and felt the first shadow of destiny darken her heart. The winds turned against them. The Roman fleet closed in like wolves. Smoke filled the air, and the roar of catapults drowned the cries of men. Amid the chaos, Cleopatra's flagship faltered. Fire spread along the sails. Antony, seeing her retreat, believed she was lost, and in that moment his courage shattered. He abandoned the battle, chasing her through smoke and ruin, as Rome's victory sealed itself behind them. The Nile welcomed them home, but Egypt was no longer safe. Weeks passed in silence. The once glorious palace echoed with emptiness. Antony's armies deserted him. His pride withered. Cleopatra tried to speak of rebuilding, of strategy, of hope, but he looked at her with eyes hollowed by failure. "Rome is the future," he said bitterly. "We are only its echo." Yet still she loved him. Not as she had loved Caesar with intellect and ambition, but as a woman loves the ruin she cannot save. When Octavian's legions marched into Alexandria, the city trembled. Cleopatra retreated to her mausoleum, the tomb she had built for herself years before, a monument of white stone and gold surrounded by the scent of lotus and death. There she waited, knowing that fate was drawing its final breath. Antony, misled by false rumour, was told she had taken her own life. Desperate and broken, he turned his sword upon himself. His servants carried his dying body to the mausoleum, where Cleopatra received him in trembling arms. Blood stained her hands, his breath shallow and uneven. "Do not mourn," he whispered. "We have found eternity in each other." She pressed her lips to his forehead as his life faded into silence. The Queen of Egypt held her lover until the warmth left his skin, and with it the last piece of her heart. Outside, Octavian's army approached. Cleopatra understood what awaited her: chains, humiliation, a Roman parade where she would be dragged through the streets as a trophy. She would not allow it. Not for herself, not for Egypt, not for Antony. She ordered her servants to bring her finest robes, the royal linen woven with threads of gold, the crown of serpents upon her brow. She adorned herself not as a prisoner but as a goddess. In her chamber she received a small basket of figs, inside which coiled her silent salvation, the asp, sacred to Isis. She dismissed her attendants, save for her two most loyal handmaidens. The air was heavy with the scent of myrrh and rosé. Cleopatra looked toward the open doors, where sunlight spilled like molten gold upon the floor. "Tell Rome," she said softly, "that Cleopatra lived as a queen and dies as one." The serpent struck swiftly. A tremor passed through her, then stillness. Her lips parted in a final breath, not of pain, but of peace. The asp slid from her arm and vanished among the figs, as if retreating into myth. When Octavian entered moments later, he found her lying upon a couch of gold, serene as a statue of a goddess. Death had restored to her what life had taken: her majesty, her mystery, her immortality. Outside, the Nile flowed endlessly, carrying her name toward eternity. The city wept, but the river did not pause. For the river knew empires rise and fall, lovers live and perish, but Cleopatra would live forever in the current of history, where beauty and power meet beneath the moon.